Well, good afternoon, everybody.
Good
Good
afternoon.
afternoon.
Hello. On behalf of St. John's, Peter and I would like to welcome our guests this afternoon for a conversation. First, I'd like to introduce Bea Moyes, who is a board-certified cognitive specialist, writer, and national speaker. She is the creator of A Childlike Mind, a company created for educating parents of children with unique behavioral and learning needs. She's a respected and trusted parenting coach and consultant and serves as a board of trustees member at Kids with Possibilities and the Lunch Project. She has a monthly blog called Thrive in Charlotte Parent Magazine that gives tips on the challenges of parenting special needs children. Bea's worked as a behavioral consultant for years with extensive experience working with parents of children who have a variety of diagnoses such as autism spectrum disorders, anxiety disorder, conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, and ADHD. She's trained hundreds of families on parent management training, providing parents with useful tools, practical techniques, and teaching strategies. Our next guest is Bob McCulty, practiced in Charlotte, North Carolina since 1980. His undergraduate work was at Duke. His master's in clinical psychology is from Lone Mountain College, and his PhD in clinical psychology is from then named the Fielding Institute, now named Fielding Graduate University. His graduate research interests were in the fields of psychological stress and coping styles. A primary focus of his current practice is on couples therapy that includes healthy sexual relationships. His work has included working with victims of boundary violations, as well as professional and others who have violated boundaries and the consequences to all those involved. His work is trauma-informed, and his basic assumption is that change is possible. His goal as a therapist is to help people be satisfied with the decisions they make. His current spiritual growth focuses on Celtic spirituality, and he's been a member of St. John's Episcopal Church since 1988. And last but not least, our last guest is Richard Tedeschi, PhD, Professor Emeritus in the Department of Psychological Science at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and Distinguished Chair of the Boulder Crest Institute for Post-Traumatic Growth in Bluemont, Virginia, where he has been one of the developers of the Warrior Path program based on post-traumatic growth principles. He's published several books and numerous professional articles on post-traumatic growth, an area of research he developed that examines transformation in the aftermath of traumatic life events. Dr. Tedeschi serves as a consultant to the American Psychological Association on Trauma and Resilience, and is a fellow of the Division of Trauma Psychology and the Division of Psychotherapy, and is also past president of the North Carolina Psychological Association. Again, we are deeply indebted to you all for your service and also for your time this afternoon as Peter and I gather with you to really have a conversation regarding the circumstances that all of us are facing right now amidst this COVID-19 pandemic, and to really explore and deep dive into what we're seeing, I guess at this point in our discussion, what we're seeing in terms of anxiety, individual anxiety, systemic anxiety, and to explore what you all have seen, and to also talk at length about what advice you might have for not just clergy, but for all of us as we cope with this together. Peter, do you have anything you want to start in with as we begin? Peter, I think we lost your volume.
There we go. No, I muted myself. This is a classic Zoom error. I'm glad I get to fire the first shot. So, I mean, obviously these are difficult times for lots of people. People are experiencing this very differently. And the assumption is that when we get back together, obviously things will be different. We're looking at the church trying to come together in small groups in different ways. Obviously people will have to wear masks and that sort of thing. And then at least I don't know about you all, but as I've experienced going out into the world, I've gone to Home Depot and the grocery store and those things. People are all doing different stuff. Some people have masks on, some people don't. Some people are all over the map in terms of how they're handling this particular situation. And Brad sort of described this, I think, as a period of anxiety. And so maybe my first question is that maybe you could speak to what we're all feeling, and and how might we even define that term? Is it anxiety? Is it grief? Is it loss? How are you maybe in your practices seeing people react to this? And maybe in particular, how are they, in terms of defining that, how are they reacting to one another, both to themselves and connecting with other people? And I'll just open that up to whoever wants to take a shot.
All right, I'll start to fill in the silence here. There are a lot of individual differences in how people are responding to this, because I've heard a couple people say to me this same phrase: "We're all in the same storm, but in different boats." And I think that's pretty good, because people's situations are quite different. I see a lot of people who are single and living alone and feel quite isolated. Then I have people who are in difficult relationships and they're forced to be together and there's a lot of conflict. And then I have people who are thriving in the situation as they discover ways of handling their family lives that allow them to really enjoy each other, and they're grateful that they are in as good position as they might be compared to some other people. So a lot of differences there. But in terms of the anxiety part, I think the anxiety certainly arises out of some of these situations, obviously, where people are losing their jobs and they're worried about finances. They're worried about their health or the health of the people around them. There's obvious sources of anxiety. And then there's the anxiety of uncertainty, because we don't know where all this is going, what the future holds. It's hard to prepare for something that's so difficult to predict. So that's another source of anxiety, is the lack of certainty about our future. And then you mentioned the loss part. Grief comes from a lot of different kinds of losses, not just the death of a person, but the loss of all kinds of roles that we might have, traditions we might have, things that we that are not possible under these circumstances. So there's a lot of loss that people are up against now, and how to make up for that is quite a challenge, and means that we have to be creative and innovative in responding to this situation. So that's my start on things, and maybe everybody can start to piggyback on what I've started.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with everyone what they just said, but also we really have to look at what is anxiety as far as defining it, which is basically anxiety is the body's response to stress. That's what anxiety is. And really, there hasn't been a period of our lifetime where we know the whole world, together collectively is under, this huge amount of stress. And whether it's stress, whether it's finances or the uncertainty of it all, or just not knowing what's going on or what to do, we know that all of us are under some type of stress. And how do we deal with it? For me, in my practice, where I deal mostly with parents, where I only deal with parents, the stress of how do I explain this to my kids? What do I tell my children? What do I do when I don't even know what to do? Like what to say, what not to say, how much of the, how much of the information do I know? Do I share with children? How much do I hold back? So there's this huge level of uncertainty with what is it that I can do right now to help my kids? And even for me personally, as a mom, and, I have 2 young children, it's the same thing. They're asking me, well, what is COVID-19? What does that mean exactly? Forget the pure, it's a virus. Obviously we get that, but why is it so different? Why is it impacting us so greatly than anything else we've had before? Why is it a pandemic versus just a cold or a common flu or something like that? So, just the fact that we need to get to the baseline of stress and the anxiety that this is causing everyone, and how everybody's, physiological response is different to it. Some people, for them, anxiety means they work more. Some people work less. Some people shut down. Some people retreat. Some people go jogging. Like, we all have our different ways of responding to our, to stressors within our body and what we do as far as coping. And I'm finding some interesting ways to, feedback from my clients about how they're coping with stress. And especially for parents who are now teachers, a role that they did not anticipate on doing, at the beginning of the school year, but also navigating, teleconferencing, telehealth, and all these different, video conferencing, like, the little issues we were having before this. The parents are feeling the stress of dealing with that as well. So that it's not just the COVID-19 stress, but all the other stuff that comes with it. And I think just, defining anxiety and having individuals define anxiety within themselves of what does it mean when I'm anxious? For me, when I'm anxious, I tend to overdo. Like, for me, I'm a busybody. I like to be kept busy. I like to have 50 billion projects at a time. And when I'm really stressed out, I will take on more than I can handle because I'm trying to distract myself from my stress. So that's usually when my husband steps in and say, you're stressed out and you're taking on too much and you're stressing all of us out. Like, you're adding too much to our plate as well. But I'm like, no, this is how I cope. It's great. It's wonderful. This is what I'm supposed to do. But, just realizing what are the triggers within yourself? What are the triggers within your family setting? What are some things within your kids? Because another thing is children respond to stress so different than adults. And it's always in a behavioral way. They may have, more meltdown, more tantrums, more acting out, more bad behavior. And as parents, we tend to dismiss the fact that this is how they respond to stress. It may not align with how we would do it because, of course, our frontal lobe is developed so we can do more, prefrontal thinking and, seeing more things, like the consequences are greater. But for them, it may just be a behavioral challenge that they're going to do, a meltdown, a talking back, a disrespect, or whatever it may be. But just being mindful that they're under a lot of stress and they're anxious, and that's how anxiety is presenting to them, at children.
Sure.
I'd like to build on those ideas that you were just talking about, with anxiety being one of the responses that we can have to stressful circumstances, whether or not they're environmental, coming in from outside, or things that come in inside of us. Anxiety is, excuse me, it's an emotion. It's an emotion of worry, of anticipating in the future difficulties that create turmoil and typically not a great sense of well-being. Now, when we use the words coping with psychological stress, psychological stress is a circumstance where our resources of managing are being overtaxed, that we don't have the internal wherewithal to manage our thoughts, feelings, moods, pains that are inside to a way where it is basically endangering a sense of well-being. So it involves many physiological responses that can be seen where people are getting nervous, pacing, not being able to think as clearly as they want, pretty highly aroused. But it also brings up another possibility, and that's what that you were alluding to. In some people, seem to be doing okay. What that suggests is that they somehow have some resilience, that they somehow, maybe through life experience or whatever, are highly challenged and still may be very aroused, even aroused physiologically, but they're up to the task. So it's whether or not we are going to be overwhelmed, which means we can no longer smoothly go about doing the task at hand. And there's such a huge range with that. So I want to have those ideas of anxiety and coping and psychological stress and resilience also be part of the conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad we're starting off with a definition of terms, because I've long been struck by the observation that it's not uncommon to hear folks talk about even using the word anxious in a way that is both positive and negative. And I'm not sure sometimes what they mean. Like, I'm anxious to come see you. And I'm thinking, is that a good thing or a bad thing? You know, so I'm glad we're starting this conversation off defining terms. And it leads me to a question. Are we always anxious of our anxiety? Are we always conscious of our anxiety? Or is there some experience of anxiety that remains in the unconscious, especially as we begin to move further into the conversation about coping mechanisms? I mean, when we talk about being aware of our anxiety, how aware can we be when we are in the anxious moments, if you will?
I don't think we're aware of our anxieties at all, unless you've had some training and some mindfulness and just, had repeated exposure or been in therapy. Then you know what your triggers are. And you're aware that, okay, this is why I'm feeling anxious. This is the feeling. This is what anxiety feels like for me. This is how I respond to it. But I think society as a whole, we're not that aware of, what the feeling of anxiety is, or when we're anxious. We do use the term loosely. I hear it all the time, like, I'm anxious about this and I'm anxious about that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's nervousness. It's okay to be nervous, but anxiety, we're talking about a clinical term here. So, you can be nervous about something, but you don't have anxiety over it. You're not actively trying to avoid that interaction, which is what anxiety really dictates, as opposed to, I'm nervous about it, I don't feel so great, but I'm going to do it anyway. So nervousness and anxiety, I think they're used interchangeably, especially by the layperson. But again, that's fine, because they're not really defining anxiety. They're just calling it something that it's not. But I don't think, just based on what I've seen and what I've experienced, that we as a society, as a culture, know when we're anxious, or, or consciously aware of that particular emotion. I don't think we're aware of it, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I think you're right that very often the anxiety starts to show up in other ways. Like, B, you were just talking before about how kids show things behaviorally, and for us human beings, anxiety is pretty uncomfortable, and it can be converted into different things. Sometimes it's converted into pain or other kinds of physical problems. Sometimes it's converted into aggression. Sometimes it starts to show up as other kinds of avoidance strategies, where people get into substance abuse and that sort of thing. There's different ways anxiety can go that hide the fact of what it is underneath. And then, of course, there are positive ways that we can convert anxiety into something that's healthy. We can get into that later, but it has these disguises, I'm afraid, for many people, and that makes people unaware of what's really going on with them.
It reminds me of one of my favorite Peanuts comic strips from years and years ago. The first frame is Snoopy lying on his back on top of the doghouse. The second frame is Snoopy lying on his back on top of the doghouse with a few snowflakes coming down. The third frame, same Snoopy on the doghouse with a lot of snow coming down. And the fourth frame is the outline of Snoopy under a blanket of snow with the caption, "That's what happens if you have no anxiety." So I want to bring in that I think there is an operational level for most people of some monitoring of the environment for threat, the kind of self-talk that may go on inside their mind, that there is kind of an idling, at least, sense of of some mild turmoil that can make you get out of the snowstorm.
Yeah, anxiety certainly has a purpose. It serves a function.
Yeah.
And it's, Bea was talking before about, the kind of warning system that we have. It's part of the alarm system that protects us from threats. So if we know what it is, if we can identify it, then we can do something productive and constructive in response to it, recognizing that we're at least reacting as if there's a threat, real or imagined.
Yeah, one question I have, maybe a follow-up to this is, well, obviously we're entering, if anxiety is the word we're using, a prolonged period of anxiety, and we don't even know if we're a tenth of the way in, or whatever. I mean, but in current thinking is this could go on for a year. It almost is kind of like being in a war. I don't know how to even compare it, because it's very different. I mean, and it's subtle, and things are still normal, but they're not. And so it's this very sort of difficult period where you're trying to sort things out, and there's a lot of confusion, but it's prolonged. And so my question is what can we expect to see people going through as this continues to progress into months and maybe even a year? Are we looking at depression? Are we looking at PTSD? That might be post and when we're still in it, but I'm just kind of curious, what are the long-term effects of something like this? I mean, at least your best guess of that.
I mean, I definitely see an increase of depression, especially for those of us who are already sensitive to mental health issues and already, have a hard time with getting over certain things, and, just the uncertainty of it all. So I could definitely see an increase in depression. I also can see PTSD for, we have our high schoolers, the seniors in college, just those of us right now who are going through these huge life-changing milestones that require celebration as a whole, celebration with others and other people, kindergarten, not being able to attend that. I mean, my daughter graduated from kindergarten 2 years ago, and that was a big milestone for me. I was very excited. I was crying. My husband thought I was crazy, but it was like a really big, impactful moment for me. And again, it was just kindergarten. It wasn't a big deal in the grand scheme of things. It's not high school or college. But for me as a parent, that was an important moment for me, an important milestone. So I can definitely see parents missing out on some of those things, especially if it was important to them. I don't know if I don't know where the milestone is more important or more impactful. I don't know if it's the kindergartners. I don't know if it's the high schoolers, if the college graduates, weddings that are not happening. Like, there's a lot of things that are not occurring. And then there are people dying and funerals that can't be attended. So it's not just these great milestones that are, about celebrating life, but there's also celebrating a life one person had. And now that not being able to attend well, or those wishes not being followed through, and people not being able to say their final goodbye. So I definitely see some just PTSD regarding those life events that we don't think about. Like right now, we're trying to stay safe, we're staying home, and we're doing all these things. So, my daughter's in the 2nd grade, my son's in the 3rd grade. We don't have any milestone. I'm not getting married. Like, there's nothing big happening. We're just home, and we're staying home, and we're staying safe, and we're happy. But if there was something big, if I had some huge plan, short of vacation that's been canceled, but that's fine. Like if I had something big, I don't know the trauma that would leave me, if I had to experience that. So I'm sure it's leaving other individuals that type of trauma that, going forward.
I think that one of the things that we're seeing already in everyday life, separate from the major life events that Bea was talking about, is just getting through day to day is causing people a lot of fatigue. People are getting very tired of this whole situation and the adjustments that they've had to make, not knowing when they can go back to something approaching normal. So I think fatigue is starting to set in, and the dangers, of course, of that are that when people are fatigued, they become more irritable, less cooperative, and people are going to let down their guard on what they need to do to keep themselves and other people safe. So, I think that'll be a major problem that we confront moving forward. Like you're saying, Peter, this could go on, who knows, for another year or so. And, it's, if you start to think about, wow, how's it going to be, in that time frame for us to keep doing all this stuff that we're doing and missing out on the things we're missing out on. So I think fatigue is going to be a big problem.
What I'm seeing as well, particularly increases of irritability, and sometimes like a couple may come to a realization that they're standing in a grocery line or in a therapist session, and are having a fight about something that one of them just eventually looks at the other and says, "Why are we arguing about this? What's happening is we're kind of wigged out with all that's going on, and so we're going to argue about something like how do you pack the dishwasher, that we might have some sense of control over." That sense of powerlessness and is one of the most intolerable human experiences, and people will convert vulnerability that seems to be intolerable for them to have into other kinds of coping, into getting angry, or into bravado, or you're not the boss of me, and etc. That leads to certain kinds of acting out of that vulnerability by not having enough flexibility in how we defend ourselves inside.
Is that maybe what we just saw a news article about a guy who broke the arm of a lady at Target because she asked him to wear a mask? I didn't read it. I just saw the headline. And is that the sort of thing
Yeah, that kind of thing. I saw the video of that being escorted out of Target and turning around, and I think it was actually a male. It was pretty fuzzy video that he punched, and it turned into a fight and being thrown on the floor, and that kind of thing.
Yeah,
I heard an interesting announcement recently that was talking about kind of what we're going through is a marathon, and you train for the marathon, and you get about 2 miles from the end, and your lactic acid has built up, and then somebody comes along and says, "Oh, by the way, there's 3 more miles to go," and then this just not happening. You all were talking about the fatigue and everything that can kick in. What I would be curious to hear you all reflect. What is it about this pandemic that you think is affecting us this way? And I don't mean the medical impact of this, but speaking psychologically, what is it about this pandemic that is bringing this out? What are the experiences that you see that we're going through? Explain the loss. Explain the variations.
I think it's the unknown. I mean, it's just the unknown. Anxiety lives in the future, not knowing what to do, how to handle it, not having proper plans in place. And just thinking about initially when this started 9 weeks ago, I think, but initially when we were quarantined and we were told as parents, you're going to homeschool your child. We're like, okay, clearly the school has a system. They have a plan in place, and all we're going to do is just log on, and the teachers are going to be there, and this is going to be fine. But there was no plan, and there was no direct way to handle it. And it was this huge learning curves for parents, for children, and, again, getting the mental fatigue, feeling overwhelmed and exhausted. And it was just the unknown. And as each week progressed, nothing was made more clear. We weren't like, oh, well, now we know what's going on. And I'm not referencing just the school aspect, just what are we doing? When are we getting out of this? Are some states open? Some states are not open. What's open? When they are open, what can we do? What can't we do? So it's just still, I think it's just the unknown. When we don't know what to expect as a whole, that creates the ability to have a meltdown. And what we're seeing is basically a lot of adults having meltdowns and tantrums because they're anxious and they don't know what to do. They don't know what to expect, and they don't know how to respond. So I think for me, it's the unknown.
Yeah, it strikes me as just this is a broad and completely disorienting experience for individuals and society at large. And I'm just really kind of fascinated by what we're experiencing by ourselves, because one of the things Peter and I've talked about this pretty extensively. It's sort of like when this thing first started, it was almost like, I called it the stiff upper lip. We're going to get through this. We're going to hunker down. And some people even treated it like a little miniature vacation.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect because we kind of anticipated, well, surely this isn't going to last that long, right? And then the more this went on, it suddenly started to kind of go dark into, oh, this isn't funny anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And now you're kind of beginning to see these anecdotal outbursts of aggression, and trying to figure out how to deal with this.
The thing about the plans, I think is so true, because there are some people for whom this is just completely disorienting, as you say, because they've never been through anything like this. They just don't know what to do about it. And then there are other people for whom this isn't all that different. I think about one client of mine who has some serious health problems that has kept her isolated. I mean, she lives pretty much in isolation. And she can't go out and do things for herself. And people have to kind of come to her house and bring her things, and that's the way she lives. So she says to me, well, nothing's changed for me. This is just the way I've always lived for years now. So it's not very anxiety rousing at all.
Right.
It's just life is normal pretty much for her. So it just depends on how strangely different this is compared to what we're used to.
Yeah, one of the things I've been thinking about, at least what I'm feeling in myself, is when I encounter a situation that I expect to be a certain way, and it winds up being very different. There are these odd things that are sort of triggering me into what I would describe as grief, or I don't know if it's anxiety or what it is. It's a kind of a unique feeling. But like I was making up signs for the church, we're making plans for us to be able to come back whenever that date is. And making these signs up about wear a mask, wash your hand, use this entrance, there are all this sort of things. And as I'm trying to imagine in my mind what that's going to be like for people, it just raises this tension in me, like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? What is this? So I'm thinking, when people come back, if you go into the grocery store for the first time, you see people wearing masks, it can go, whoa, this is, So I'm wondering, as people start to come back in this new way, I'm imagining that they're going to be keyed up, and so what I'm wondering is, or they'll be triggered in some way. So what I'm wondering is, what kind of signs should we look for in other people? And how do we give them the space or the grace to exhibit their anxiety behavior, conscious or unconscious? How do we process that internally and go, wow, okay, they just may be going through something. I'm just going to, let's give each other room.
I was just thinking, I'm not sure how well this is answering your question, but it made me think about the wearing of the masks, and how, the masks deprive us of some information about that other person. We can't see their entire face. So we know a little bit less about what they might be feeling or how they're reacting. We can look in their eyes, and that certainly tells us quite a lot. But there's the whole rest of the face that we don't see. We can't see people smile or frown, or we don't know what's going on back there. Yeah. And so that's one thing that I think will be unnerving for people. It's just interacting kind of half blind like this. And so that will be unnerving. So I think we have to get better at communicating in some other ways to make sure people understand us and what's going on with us, and maybe addressing people more directly and trying to show them that we're interested in their experience.
Mm. I think checking in with people and checking in with loved ones, families, strangers, just people that we're exposed to, just, hey, are you okay? How's it going? And not make any assumptions and not just think that they're okay or that they're doing well because they look like they're doing well. Because another thing that's happened during this time is a lot of us have gone to social media as a form of outlet and as a form of coping mechanism to just kind of see what's going on. And I know for my generation, we make light of everything. Nothing is serious. So there's just this generational difference, but it doesn't mean that we're not also anxious and we're not also feeling the stress of it, but just checking in on your friends and checking in on your loved ones and checking in with family and saying, hey, how are you doing? Are you okay? As we enter society or phase into society or whatever it is that we're doing, not make any assumption that someone's okay or that they're not okay, just because they may be of a certain age group. One of the things I've realized, actually not realized, one of the things I've seen evolved, I'm the designated person to go to the grocery store in my family. So it's me that goes to the grocery store. So I've seen the progression of, people going in fine. Then I've seen, some people just covering just with the gloves. Then now I see the gloves and the mask. And, so I've just seen the transition. And initially going to the grocery store was kind of like, oh, I get to get out the house. But now it feels more anxiety provoking because everyone has on a mask and gloves, and it just seems more terrifying. It just doesn't feel normal. So it seems less normal. And I think just what we thought was the norm, there's no such thing anymore. I don't think we will be returning back to that or anytime soon or within a year, just because I've seen the progression of, just going down to the grocery store versus now everyone's in a mask. And then there's literally a guy down every aisle mopping every single aisle. So it feels like, okay, they're doing more things to keep cleanliness and viruses at bay, but it also creates a feeling of this is not normal. This is not what I'm used to. So I think checking in with people, calling people, and letting them know what resources are out there, such as telehealth, teleconferencing, and teletherapy, just letting them know what's available to them, reaching out to churches, reaching out to practices, just let them know there's resources available to them and they can use those resources and not to be scared to, but ultimately just checking in on them.
Yeah. I want to get back, Peter, to some of what I took as the direction of your question about signs at the church. And as a member of this church, I'm reminded that the first primary audience of why we're having this conversation is so that it can be on the church website. I don't know what else will happen to it, but it is a challenge. All those things that come up about, the signage, and what I think is a critical factor to help us manage our nervous systems and not get overwhelmed by this is, in a single word, leadership. I know at the national level, I'm looking very forward to reading the 60 pages of recommendations about how to open up and the things that have to be taken into account. I'm appreciative that in our Episcopal land, the bishops have taken leadership and have made some decisions that have felt caretaking and interested in health, as well as being compassionate to what other people's experience is. So I know what I look for, say about the question of signage, is how can particularly you and Peter and Brad, how can you have the support that you need and the consultations that you need to take care of this corner of of your positions as priests for a congregation.
Yeah, I think maybe some of my anxiety is around the fact that I'm on the committee that's making that up. So,
No.
so part of it is that I'm not being given direction. I'm creating with a group of people what that direction is. And so I
Yeah.
suppose maybe I'm feeling a little bit more anxiety maybe than other people who we handed a set of directions on, here's how to think about what you ought to do. Although every church is very different, as you all know, all across denominations, even within a denomination, each building, each church has its own charism, its own culture, its own socioeconomic backgrounds, its own different style of architecture and various things. And there are all these little nuanced things that we have to watch out for. But, I think when parishioners interact with one another, there's the concern about how do we treat one another well? How do we give one another grace? Maybe just as we're talking to that audience, what advice would you give to parishioners for, if you see somebody who's keyed up, or if you see somebody who may be exhibiting some signs of anxiety, what could they do to help a parishioner from 6 feet away with a mask on? What might they do?
Well, I think one of the most important things for people to know is they're not in this alone. That people care about what's happening to them, and to get that message across. I know we can't hug each other or anything like that right now, but you have to find some other way to give them the hug, and to let them know that they have someone they can talk to or go to, or someone who can help them. And that all of us are feeling some version of what they're feeling. So I think that's an important message to get across. And I think as far as the signs in the church and all those things that you're working on, I wonder if, when you send out a letter or a message to people trying to explain this, that does some good to get people prepared. But maybe even a better way, at least for some people who have the technology, is you make a little video and you walk them around the church and you show them, here's how we're going to do it. Here's where you're going to sit, and here's how people are going to come in, and here's how and you just kind of make a video where you kind of walk around and you explain some things. So, hey, when you come Sunday, here's what you'll see, and it's look like this. And maybe that'll give people a little bit more comfort too. Just know a little bit more about what to expect, so things aren't so unclear and kind of mysterious.
Definitely. That's a good point.
I think that kind of approach shows empathy and compassion, and is an opportunity to model maybe one sign of what some have called adult maturity, and that is to be able to hold different feelings, emotions at the same time, not to, to be able to have gratitude and sorrow in your hands at the same time. Not to personalize this too much, but I'm a card-carrying member of Kindermorn, and have led groups for Kindermorn that, Richard, you've studied a good bit, and also a card-carrying member of the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention. And that I've experienced someone very close to me, brother, committing suicide. And there is a certain kind of resilience and some life experience where you get some learning about how to hold differing emotions and feeling states in yourself at the same time, and still smoothly go about, or try to smoothly go about, doing the task at hand. And particular pieces of that are listening. Yeah, I can't move that 6 feet to physically give someone a hug, but I can hug them with my voice and my eyes, and emoting compassion and presence and availability. And that provides a certain kind of experience of a safe enough environment that says we are in this together. You're not alone.
Yeah, I think that's so important, Bob, what you're saying, to remind people that even though we're going through some terrible times, there's the and also to it. There, yes, this is anxiety arousing, this is difficult. And also, at the same time, we see people who are responding with care and responding with help.
Mhm.
And so the and also part is important to get in there so they can see both sides of this.
B, you raised something earlier that I kind of wanted to circle back around to. I'm curious if you all are seeing generational differences in how to cope with this, especially as we talk about coming back together. They're filled with so many representatives from the different generations, and it strikes me that different generations may be dealing with this differently, particularly in terms of the use or the reliance on social media. And I'm curious if you all are seeing anything like that might also afford us the opportunity to consider how we care for one another without treating it as though, one-stop shop treats everybody the same way.
Well, I wanna take this opportunity to clear the millennials. Initially, when this started, the millennials were receiving a lot of negative press, and that we're out there, we're on the beach, we're doing this, we're doing that. That's Generation Z. That is not the millennials. Millennials like myself, we have children, we are concerned about our parents, we're trying to keep them in, we're worried about bills. So the millennials we're not the problem. But it's definitely a different approach to it, where my generation, we do make light of everything because we haven't really experience anything significantly enough in our lifetime, meaning, from high school till adult age. I mean, yes, we've experienced the 2008 crash, but again, we were young, so it didn't really impact us to that, big, it didn't impact us that much. And we've also experienced 9/11. Again, we were in college at that time. So there's been things that happen that hasn't really made us, I guess, resilient to something like this. But we use social media as an outlet, as a platform to connect, to discuss, to make light of everything, to, kind of move on and get through it. So for the millennials, or, specifically my group of friends and cohorts, we immediately thought, okay, so we can't be together, but we're kind of used to not being together. We're used to, I have a friend in Italy that I went to grad school with that I connect with all the time. I have a lot of friends in Florida where I'm from. I have a friend in Georgia, I have a friend in Ohio. So I'm used to connecting with people across the state and waters and country. So it wasn't that big of a change to now we're moving to that being the platform, the only form of platform. Where the older generation, they're having a harder time because they like the interaction, face to face. They want to get, phone calls. Like we don't like phone calls. We rather get a text. So it's just some things are, we're used to already, but we can see the younger generation, Generation Z, they're more comfortable with less interaction than we are. So I think it just changes per generation just based on what you grew up with and what you experienced and what you saw and what you are comfortable with. But I definitely noticed there's a trend with how we're coping and how we're, interacting. I had my mom FaceTime my children, and it was just interesting just to watch her navigate that, because typically we do this anyway, but she likes her phone calls. She prefers a phone call. I cannot send her a text. So, she rather hear my voice. So, but she preferred the phone call over the video conference, which I thought was peculiar, because I'm like, well, you can see them. And she was like, I'd rather have a phone call. So I think it's just different based on how we're responding to it based on the generation. And when technology was introduced, for us, it was introduced around middle school. The next generation, it was introduced at birth. So it's just a difference of when it was introduced and how comfortable we are and how we navigate this situation with COVID and technology, and the cross generation of how we're just responding to it differently.
It reminds me of how I was watching my 17-year-old daughter lately teach her grandmother in her mid-70s how to text. And when her grandmother finally got it, it was just this victory. You know, it's like, oh, now we can really communicate. Yeah. So, but you know, these generational differences, you know, also we can overplay. We have to understand individuals, and everybody's got their different family and cultural backgrounds and life experiences, and just knowing more about the individual and, you know, what's comfortable for them and how they handle all this is important for us, rather than to do any stereotyping of anything.
Mm-hmm.
You know, really listening to people, getting to know their experience, you know, ultimately that's how we're going to be of most help.
Right. That's right. You know, it's interesting, and I think I speak on behalf of almost all clergy out there. You quickly learn that different generations, to some degree, and there are variations in this, but you quickly learn that they all like to be communicated to differently. You really wouldn't email somebody, you know, who's older, and you really wouldn't call somebody who's younger. But you can mostly talk to them all on the handshake line, you know, in the same kind of way. But it's really interesting to sort of, and so a church winds up, because sort of the marketing for a church is everyone, it's all generations. You wind up having to do all of the levels of communication, not just, you know, if we were only dealing with one particular segment, then that's how we would sort of gear our communication. But we wind up having to do this broad-based approach. And it has been very difficult in this time. And many people who are older are getting on technology for the first time. And in fact, we have a parishioner who is older and one who is also has some sort of cognitive challenges. And we are setting up a Chromebook and getting it to him. And then we're going to figure out how to vector into it so that we can take it over and so that he can connect. But it's so important because he's just so isolated, and we want to help people. And you know, so some of those things are real difficulties, I think, for people. Yeah, so people are reacting differently to it, and I'm wondering about, and we're sort of coming up on our time, but I'm wondering about, you know, parishioners is sort of interacting with one another in person when they're there and they got their masks on, and how might they see stress in one another, and how might they be a comfort? So I don't know. We sort of hit on that a little bit.
Well, I think you have to ask some questions and be open and make sure that people know that they can say what's going on with them. I think that's an important thing, that people don't have to hide behind their masks or hide their stress or try to appear more together than they really feel. You know, that's something that we all kind of get embarrassed about when we're under stress and anxiety, and be open with things. And that's the important message to get across, I think.
You know, I think that's somewhat generational too, and maybe I'm wrong, but what I've experienced is people who are older tend to look at, no offense, your professions and say, and the people who are younger are like, give me to a therapist. I don't know if you've experienced that or not, but maybe that's a dealing with your feelings kind of thing. I don't know, and maybe a cultural sort of thing.
Yeah, I think there is some of that, but I also have a remarkable number of people in my practice who are in their 60s and 70s and even 80s. Maybe that's because I'm so old myself. But it's you know, it's true that you know, seeking some professional to help them through what's going on in their family life with themselves or their kids is not typical for a lot of people. It's, you know, and it's something that I think, you know, you can help people understand and accept as something useful. And hopefully this video that you're making will show people that we got something to offer too.
It sounds like one of the things that I'm hearing from all three of you all, one of the main principles for how we think about coming back together is not only doing what we can to pay attention to what's going on within ourselves, but at the same time, making the effort to reframe our perspectives so that we begin to consider the other person as well. I've heard several of you all today talk about asking the other person questions so that we're then put in a position of listening. And so it strikes me that what I'm hearing you all talk about is making sure that we don't completely self-isolate within our own world of feelings and perspectives, that we're not open to even just asking how the other person is really doing and being there to listen and be present with them as they just begin to explore what's going on within them, and then vice versa, as a way to, draw that connection for how we're all in this together, sure enough.
I think one of the best ways to handle this then is for people to look for some way to be of service to benefit other people, turn their anxieties and uncertainties into something that's going to make a difference in the world and in some way. If it's the next door neighbor or someone in their family or the greater community, just look for ways to be of service.
Great point. Great point. Well, I think we are up against the end of our time. Thank you all so much for being part of this. I think it would, a first step, if you will, in this great conversation as we look at this. And I think this will go a long way to helping us in dealing with this and coping with this and learning how to live with one another, love one another, and anticipate coming back together in new ways. B, I resonate with your response about, there may not be going back to normal. We're looking at something that's going to be unknown on the horizon, and we don't know what that is yet. But I think we'll do it together. And absolutely. So thank you all so much for being with us and for giving us your time and your expertise. And we will certainly be staying in touch.
Great. Great. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thanks for bringing us together.
Thank you.
It was a privilege. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.